How do we define the West? When you think of the West here in America, you might imagine men on horseback with big hats, slinging guns, and saving damsels from train tracks. But what you think of is not the West, not the real American West. You are thinking of Western films, which became a nationalist genre unique to the culture of the United States. The genre is based on the colonization of the westmost side of North America, specifically the places we now call California, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and the other states that border the Pacific coast. Known as the westward expansion, United States settlers started to migrate towards the mysterious West around 1803 thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. This was aided by the religious and cultish mentality around manifest destiny, which was the spiritual belief that America was destined to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific as ordained by Christianity. What is usually left out of these conversations about the West are the dangerous, violent realities of that manifest destiny or that Louisiana Purchase, specifically the dark reality experienced by people of color during this time. The West was used as a tool for propaganda that enables the American dream, while also erasing the voices that actually made the West possible. For example, take the popular image of a cowboy, a strong, surly white man with a handsome face and clean leather clothes, proudly riding on his horse and wearing a white hat. He is a free man who can roam where he pleases. But this was not the reality of the cowboy. In fact, most cowboys were indigenous Hispanic men. The modern cowboy is a descendant from the Mexican vaqueros, and their culture was blended into American settler life as they became employed by various white farmers. Another unknown face of the American cowboy was all the faces of black cowboys, who made up over 25% of working cowboys from the years 1860 to 1880. Being a cowboy was a popular job for black men in a post-Civil War world, and most black cowboys were former slaves or the sons of former slaves. The modern term cowboy was originally used to differentiate the demeaned black ranch workers, the cowboys, from the respected white workers, the cow hands. Indigenous Mexicans would be pushed onto reservations, abused, and paid poor wages while being a vital organ in the body of the West. Meanwhile, black men would experience an extension of slavery on the farms of white ranch owners. The movie idea of the white cowboy contradicts history and speaks to the attitudes that white Americans hold towards people of color when tangled with the idea of heroism. The West symbolized white American power, and white America could not allow a brown or black face to take that place. This type of erasure is pervasive in American film, as elaborated on by Ibram X. Kendi in his book Stamped from the Beginning. In his book, X. Kendi speaks about the structures in the United States that perpetuate racism through various things, like media or false sciences. Racism has no roots in the rational world, according to X. Kendi, and therefore people have had to create racism from scratch and push it to the wider population intentionally. European slave owners and American colonists did not enslave African people and commit genocide to the natives because of some intrinsic truth that led them towards a supremacist mindset. They created the supremacist mindset to justify their crimes. The narrative around race is divided into two halves: the designers of racism and the audience of racism. This was done very successfully regarding the American West and the films we know and love in the Western genre. To quote Jordan Peele, "Erasure is particularly horrifying because it's a lie that affects the future and the present. This erasure in Western media successfully perpetrated a racist attitude, one that removes real cowboys from cowboy stories." In fact, the first recorded use of the word racism in Oxford's English Dictionary was actually cited from a criticism of Western indigenous segregation into reservations, made by Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt wrote, "Segregating any class or race of people apart from the rest of the people kills the progress of the segregated people, or makes growth very slow. Associations of race and classes is necessary to destroy racism and classism." Racism, as we know it, quite literally had its roots in the American West, and Pratt, in my opinion, is correct, especially in regards to the West. The separation of Native Americans from the general populace has only encouraged racially violent attitudes, which then were emphasized through the Western genre. The best example I personally have of this is the infamously anti-Indigenous 1956 film The Searchers, directed by John Ford and starring Western darling John Wayne. The film follows a Confederate veteran looking for his young niece, who is kidnapped by a native tribe. Over a 5-year-long journey, John Wayne goes on a bloody quest for vengeance, full of racially motivated murder sprees, actors in brownface, and disgusting derogatory language. The film has garnered 2 different reactions, one claiming that the film is an anti-racist film with an anti-hero lead, and one declaring that the film perpetuates dangerous stereotypes against Native Americans. I tend to lean towards the latter interpretation, especially with how the actual movie treats its Native characters, and with how the movie concludes. When the main character finally finds his niece, he tries to kill her after learning she is now a child bride to the leader of the Comanche tribe, whose name is Scar, to show that he is, of course, cartoonishly evil. But John Wayne tries to kill the niece because she wants to stay and is happy being a part of the tribe, and this infuriates the main character enough that he attempts to murder her. Then, somehow, he still goes in to rescue the niece and scalps Scar, then brings the niece back home in spite of her wishes, which is framed as a victory of whiteness over the quote-unquote savage Indians. It's not uncommon for Native Americans to be the villains of a white cowboy story like this. To reference Kendi again, American settlers had to create a narrative that justified their treatment of the First Nations tribe that lived on this continent long before them. This is why so much media in the Western genre focuses on the quote-unquote primitive nature of Native people, or their quote-unquote uncivilized practices that are an affront to progress, Christianity, and whiteness. Movies like The Searchers continue to share that narrative, distributing it to the general populace, unquestioned, which reinforces the governmental propaganda that has been shared about Indigenous people for centuries now. Standing in opposition to The Searchers' hate and white-focused representation is Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. Adapted from the book of the same name, Killers of the Flower Moon was a self-proclaimed anti-Western film that follows members of the Osage tribe after oil is discovered on private tribal land, as a series of murders tries to intimidate the tribe into giving up their rights to the oil money. Instead of putting Native characters into caricatures that are used as props to push along the lives of white movie stars, the characters and killers are fully fleshed out point-of-view characters, played by race-accurate actors, sharing a fictional piece of pain that was all too accurate to the real history of the West. John Thornton Caldwell encourages us to bridge the gap between film theory and film production, saying, "These interactive forms of cognition during a shoot suggest that scholars should look beyond the standard split between film theory and film work, and consider how film industrial practices, technologies, discourses, and interaction also involve critical analysis, theoretical elaboration, and aesthetic sense-making." When it comes to Killers of the Flower Moon, I think this marriage of theory and production is necessary to understand its impact. When we think of quote-unquote cowboys and Indians, we think of a white man on a horse shooting down savages to defend a ranch. And in many ways, this image has ghosts of truth haunting it. White men would murder Indigenous people freely to claim their ranch land, or even just as a pastime. The deserts and plains of the United States are stained with blood, and Killers of the Flower Moon does not shy from this painful reality. By showing authentic faces of Native people on the screen, living the truth of the times, it holds a mirror up to our idea of the Western movie and asks us to question the roles of Native people in all Westerns. But, as I mentioned earlier, Native Americans were not the only people to suffer from erasure when we talk about the Western genre. As I mentioned, a quarter of real-life cowboys were Black, but Black representation is nearly non-existent in our mental visions of the Western movie. If you think about it, there are no Black cowboys. But there are white-guided Black stories? Kind of. What held back Indigenous representation actually encouraged the Western world of blackness in a roundabout way, mainly because the genre stood at odds with the antebellum fantasies that were in theaters at the same time, such as Gone with the Wind. In fact, a Western movie that came out only 4 years after The Searchers, titled Sergeant Rutledge, was lauded as one of the first ever movies released in America to treat racism with the quote-unquote bluntness that was needed to address modern topics, such as segregation and the realities of Jim Crow. But this movie was directed by John Ford, just like The Searchers was, which meant that the perspective was still not what was needed for more accurate and impactful representation of Black communities in Westerns. The plot of Sergeant Rutledge follows a Black man accused of rape and murder, who escapes captivity and survives a very offensively portrayed quote-unquote Indian raid, before being freed after someone else confesses to the crimes of which he was accused. While, yes, this movie does technically address anti-Black racism, it also plays into various stereotypes and unfair portrayals of both Black people and Indigenous people. For the time, it might have been fine, but looking at this film through a modern lens, it leaves much to be desired. One of the most famous westerns featuring a Black protagonist is Buck and the Preacher from 1972, starring the effervescent Sidney Poitier as Buck and the legendary Harry Belafonte as Preacher, but this film lives in a bubble separate from other Western films. Why? Because this film is technically considered a blaxploitation film, the same way that Blazing Saddles was both a Western and a satire from 1974. These two films were released after the Civil Rights Act, and you can see that the humor and narrative catharsis in both films acts as a sign of changing times. To quote film critic and essayist Lindsay Ellis, "The parody reveals the farce." Both films harmed the quote-unquote real Western genre as they poked holes in the snowy white fabric that held the flimsy American dream iconography together, and they also spoke truth into a genre that projected a false historical narrative. They showed examples of BIPOC coalition against white powers and celebrated the Black cowboy. Artel Great writes about the idea of crossing over, or the idea that there are white codes in the world of film, specifically with comedy, that allow Black culture to exist within white-dominated industries. These Western satires and blaxploitation films fit right into that crossing over box, allowing Black stories to be told in traditional white Western spaces. Recently, Jordan Peele executed a very similar deconstruction by revisiting the Black cowboy, but through the lens of a horror film instead of a parody. Horror and comedy function in similar ways, not just because of the identical science between joke and scare structures, but also because they both ask audiences to look at the world through a semi-surrealist point of view. The hyperreal is exemplified through horror and comedy, which allows Blazing Saddles and Nope to speak to Blackness in the Western realm in a way that is both authentic yet shockingly unique. It allows the movies to break the mold. In Nope, we follow a brother and sister duo who are trying to keep their family farm afloat in the wake of their father's untimely death. Soon, they learn that everything is not as it seems, and they must try to defend their farm from a space alien, while also trying to get a clear photo of the alien to sell so that they can afford to keep their land. Our lead character acts as our classic cowboy, both in his aloof attitude and his intelligent connection to the natural world around him. Technology eludes him, but his bond with the horses, the desert, and even the alien creates the image of a man who is in his true element. Played by Daniel Kaluuya, the main character fights the way a movie cowboy does, survives the way a movie cowboy does, and wins in the end in the way that only a movie cowboy can. These three Black Western movies exemplify liquid blackness, a philosophical and filmic theory developed by Dr. Alessandra Rango. According to Rango, the concept of liquid blackness can be broken into two different ideas. The first is the blackness that exists in the body, and secondly is the blackness that is packaged and sold to white people. The blackness that exists in the body, in my opinion, is proudly showcased in Nope, Blazing Saddles, and Buck and the Preacher, which stands in sharp opposition to the commodified blackness that we see in things like Sergeant Rutledge, which was specifically made to appeal to white sensibilities. A true Black story cannot be told if it is packaged for people who are not Black, for then it would have to erase what is true to the Black experience. While they are examples of crossing over, in the sense that all of these films use the hyperreal to gain entry into the space, the movies are also examples of Black stories told for Black people with an explicitly Black perspective on a Black experience that has been deprived from the Black community. The Western genre is unlike any other film genre. With roots dug deep in relatively modern world history, it's hard not to think about the real world ramifications of how we retell that history through fictional means, especially in regards to race, especially since the United States was founded on such intense racial violence. Race has been a tricky topic in Westerns, as accurately addressing race requires abandoning much of the iconic imagery that we associate with the genre as a whole. We have defined the West as a place of white success, but in reality, it is a story of BIPOC survival. To make the Western genre accurate, we must get rid of the cowboy as we know it. As we move forward in the world of cinema, it's important to start to undo the decades of propaganda that we have been subjected to as Americans, especially us as non-Black or non-Indigenous audiences. We must look at the cowboy and see him for what he really is, a white face painted over a BIPOC lived experience, and we must move forward creating new stories that speak more truth to the old ones. The Western genre has been used as a propaganda tool for decades. Let's now all use it as an educational tool. Let's write history together and uplift the real voices that made the West a thing.